Hey, welcome to episode 2 of 25 levels of cutting boards. This time we're going through boards 4 to 6, starting with a simple Endgrain cutting board. The first step is to cut strips of ash from a large plank and then cut it to the right length. Then I plane it down, first of all to clean up the top and bottom, but also to make sure it's nice and flat where I will put the glue. Then I glue up the strips to make an initial edge grain board, and then pass it through the sander again to make sure the board is nice and flat. That way, when I turn it into an end grain cutting board, the faces that I will glue together will already be flat. So obviously the next step is to cut strips from that edge grain board, and then glue them together to make it an end grain board. For this board, since my tools are well calibrated, I decided to not flip one out of every 2 strips, which in my opinion was a good decision because the end result looks really nice. Once planing the board down with the cylinder sander, I went on to sand down the board with 40 grit, and even that took a very long time, hence why end grain boards are always more expensive. The final step was to add a chamfer on the top and the bottom of the board for aesthetics, and move to the CNC for the juice groove. I use a 6mm ball tip with a depth of 5mm, and finally I add the holes for the feet and can then move on to the oiling. For this I use linseed oil and then a mixture of linseed oil and beeswax, which gives the board a deeper matte color. Finally, for this board, since there are not many features, I added my logo with my brand new iron. The end result is classy, sober, and above all, I love the end grain pattern resulting from the decision not to flip half of the strips. Now let's move on to board number 2, the end grain board with strips. This one was a very lucky board, I'll explain why in a minute. So first I cut strips of ash sapelli and paduk and glued them according to a template I calculated to get a good looking result at the end. Once I glued the strips together, I planed them down using my cylinder sander and repeated the process of the first board by cutting strips and gluing them together, except this time I intentionally flipped one out of every 2 strips to get the design I wanted. Once glued, they went back into the planer for sanding and back to the router table to add the aesthetic chamfers that I often use. Again, I spent way too much time on sanding this board, and once that was done, put it up on the CNC for the juice groove. The oiling process was great with this board because the paduk revealed a beautiful pattern. I then added the feet and saw the final results. I think it's absolutely beautiful, and the reason I got lucky with this board is that the small knot you can see in the ash went almost all the way through the board and created a wonderful feature that's quite rare to find in a cutting board. The final cutting board is not an end grain cutting board, believe it or not, but the difficulty comes from the glue up. First I did what I usually do, which is to cut and glue some strips. Here I used ash, sapelli, paduk, purple heart, and zebrano. Then I cut 35 thin strips from that board of varying thicknesses to be able to rearrange them as I wanted to make the board look glitched. I kept them from moving using 2 clamps and cut the large middle ash section in between the clamps. Then I inverted both clamps to put both halves together. If you're starting to see why this board is more complicated, that's normal because here's the hard part. I had to glue 35 sections of 2 parts in both directions, not just by clamping in one direction. In fact, it was so time consuming that in order to avoid the glue drying, I had to glue it in 3 different parts. On top of that, even though I only glued 12 strips at a time, the thin strips were actually absorbing the glue and bending, so I had to make sure to work efficiently and clamp the strips in just the right places to make sure they were held steadily. On top of that, I also added a batten on both sides and clamped that down to make sure alignment was good in the other direction. Once all 3 boards were glued together, I finally sanded down the board, added the chamfers, and headed to the CNC for finishing. And since the purple heart is, well, purple heart, I had to leave it out in the sun for a few days to get its color to pop. But once that was done, I was able to oil it and the result is just wonderful, and I really like the glitch effect. To be honest, out of those 3 boards, I don't know which one of the last 2 is my favorite, but I really love the glitch effect and the lucky feature that I got on the patterned end grain board. So thanks for watching this video. Don't forget to hit the bell if you want to be notified of the rest of this series, and feel free to check out my shop in the description. See you soon for part 3.